Hello friends, in this video I'll be making a pair of podiums with marquetry tops and some plaster castings. There is a conceptual aspect to these pieces that actually was the starting point this time, but we'll dive into the woodworking first and get back to the concept and narrative a little later. I began by processing some old pine boards. A few years ago I helped out with a remodeling job in an old house and got to keep the studs that we removed. They've been drying since the 1960s and will be perfect for this project. I employed a bit of machine work for the heaviest tasks of jointing and ripping them down to rough size, but after this it will be all hand tool work. After letting the parts rest for a few days to settle into shape, I straightened them with a number 7 plane. Winding sticks let me know if there's any twist and remove material accordingly. With one flat face established, I mark it with a pencil line and make the next face square to it. These will be my reference surfaces for this part, one of the 8 legs I need. Other parts were cut into shorter lengths to become rails that connect the legs. They were also planed flat, but I'm not bothering with the smoothing plane at this stage. The soft pine is easily dented during work, so I'll probably have to remove a few surface blemishes later anyway. No point in making them glossy smooth right now. I could then lay out my tenons on these, and since the legs are splayed at a 4-degree angle, that's the angle I need for the tenon shoulders as well. The square line you can see was my brain going into autopilot for a moment. Luckily I realized my mistake and knifed new angled lines before I had gone too far. I decided to make these tenons with the shoulder only on one side. It will likely affect the strength a bit, but I don't think it makes a meaningful difference in this case. These are not chairs that people will lean back on or dining tables that will be pushed against. The finished podiums can easily take the vertical load of anything one might reasonably want to place on them. I laid out the mortises on the legs and chopped them out. The ends of the mortises need to match the 4-degree angle of the tenon shoulders, but the combination of this very small angle, quite short tenon, and soft squishy wood meant I could just eyeball this cut. If it's 3 or 5 degrees, the joint will still go together just fine. When all these mortises were made, I could dry fit 2 legs and an upper rail in order to find the length of the lower rails. These are needed to stiffen up the construction. The long legs would otherwise be very wobbly and the leverage could break the joint at the top. With a lower rail tying the legs together, even one as thin as this, the stiffness is greatly increased and the forces acting on the individual joints become very small. I tried a few positions and settled on one that looked good to my eye at around a third of the total height. I made sure it was sitting at the proper angle and marked the location on both legs and the rail. On the rail, this mark is the shoulder, so I then measured out 15 millimeters from the line on both ends for the overall length including tenons. And then another set of single shoulder tenons was made. These are 3 millimeters wide, corresponding to my narrowest mortise chisel. Then the mortises for these were made, as I was making 2 of these pedestals at the same time, each with 4 upper and 4 lower rails. A total of 32 mortise and tenon joints were cut by hand for this project. I measured the final height, then at that point I marked where I want the leg taper to end, and drew the taper with a straight board clamped in place. A random circular object gave a good-looking transition between leg and rail. The leg was cut to length at the 4-degree angle. Then I could saw the taper. Usually I would go straight to the scrub plane to do this, because it's rather awkward to saw such a long skinny piece. But since I have the shaping around the joinery to contend with this time, planing a straight taper wasn't an option. I sawed as much as I could with the panel saw, and the curves with my homemade small bow saw. The shape was copied over onto the rest of the legs. To hold the tapered piece in the vise, I used an offcut to compensate for the angle. A combination of spoke shave and block plane was used to flatten the straight parts of the taper. This side profile of the leg resulted in a large square lump around the mortises, so I took a gouge and carved this into something with a bit more flow. I used an offcut again to support the legs while I took a few shavings with a smoother, making them ready for the glue up. The lower rails also needed some shaping. And the rails were also hit with a smoothing plane. And then it was time for the glue up. I decided to do it one pair of legs at a time, as it would be quite stressful to get 16 mortise and tenons to come together all at once. Absolutely doable, but when it's possible to divide a glue up into several steps, I almost always do it. It always turns into a little bit of a panic anyway. I used blocks cut at the 4-degree angle between the clamps and the workpieces, and made sure that I was out of square by the correct amount before tightening the final quarter turn or so. Once the glue was dry, I blended this little transition and planed a large roundover on the outside corner of the leg. This roundover is not of a fixed radius. It starts large at the top and shrinks towards the tip of the leg, so it remains proportional to the leg thickness. I really enjoy this sort of free-form, almost sculptural handplane work. A fine sandpaper removes the facets, and then I put the sub-assemblies together into the completed form. A pair of extra large winding sticks clearly shows where the legs needed trimming. Another way is to set the piece down on a known flat surface, wedge up the shortest legs and draw a line at a fixed height from the flat surface. I think the winding stick method is a bit quicker and easier in this case, when the legs are very close to final length and just need a few shavings taken off. The joints were touched up with a card scraper, and the extra length on the legs was cut down flush with the rails. It's nice to keep a little extra length for as long as possible, I think, to protect the corners from denting. And the last curve transitions were smoothed out. I need a few last components. These parts will be glued to the inside of the upper rails as attachment points for a panel that in turn will carry a plaster sculpture. More on that later. I planed these again to 4 degrees out of square, so their bottom surfaces form a flat plane once attached to the angled rails. I used a plywood spacer to get them positioned at an even height. To attach the tops of these pedestals, I decided to use a hinge and turn the top into an opening lid. Normally you'd recess the hinge halfway into the rail or box and halfway into the lid. I thought I would try to make a full depth cutout in one part instead, to see how it would look. I'm not a fan, but now I know. This piece is another attachment point. The top itself will be quite thin, so I wanted to brace it with a little bit of extra thickness. Speaking of the top, let's do some marquetry. This time I wanted to experiment with more dyed veneers, so the process began by boiling a few different pieces in blue and green color baths. I used a water-soluble powder dye, mixed it with about 4 times as much water as the packaging suggested, and let the veneers simmer for 2 hours to allow the pigments to get deep into the fibers. I also had some black dyed pieces left over from an earlier project, and that's where this picture begins. Under some transparent tracing paper, I aligned the first 2 veneers to be joined, in this case depicting the shadow and highlight of a bucket. I slip a carbon paper between the wood and the tracing, and transfer the line to be sawn onto the top veneer. I use a steel scribing tool for this, with the point ever so slightly rounded so it doesn't cut the tracing paper. This gives a very fine, distinct line on the wood. A few more pieces of masking tape secure the 2 veneers together so they don't slide around, and a paper spacer in between completes the packet. This is because the cut is done at an angle, producing beveled edges that overlap and eliminate the saw curve, and even just a 0.5 millimeter spacer allows this angle to be much less steep than it would otherwise need to be. And this is the entire process really, then it's just repeated a whole lot of times, building up the image piece by piece, hopping back and forth between the drawing and the saw. Here's a birch veneer with a nice cathedral that will become a flowing liquid in the motif. Speaking of the motif, these panels are essentially process pictures documenting the casting of the plaster sculptures that I will add later. There's 2 pictures, one of the mixing and one of the pouring, so that together they tell a sort of self-referring story of making the pieces they are attached to. Here I'm cutting in a green dyed veneer, as I start to expand the image with some background. I tested several species in the color baths, hoping that their natural color would come through and give some variety to the hue. But even this heavily diluted dye was so powerful that everything from birch to walnut turned out very similar. Here's some blue birch and blue walnut, very far from the contrast I had hoped for. Next time I'll be diluting even further and also entirely skip a few species that didn't work too well, but more on that later. The dyed veneers also turned out a bit more brittle than the natural ones, so that's something to keep in mind. The piece that came off here was waste though. Here I'm working on a hand in maple and cherry. The hands in these pictures are the most complicated elements, with the smallest pieces in the most number of different species. I think of the hands sort of as the main characters in these images, so I wanted to make them feel alive if possible. All this colored veneer, I think, raises a reasonable question. Why not just paint the picture? It would make it much easier to control the hues of color and add fine details. Why marquetry? I think there are a few answers. You could talk about the durability. A wooden surface, even just 0.6 millimeters thick, is a lot more material to wear through than a layer of paint. So for any kind of top that will have things put on it, marquetry would probably outlast a painted image. You could say it's about the historical significance of the technique, that it's worth preserving the knowledge of all old crafts, especially in this age of digitalization and generative plagiarism technology, so-called AI. You could talk about the grain of the wood, how that impacts the picture and makes it something very different from painting, a distinct look that you may or may not prefer. I think it's all of those things, but the most important aspect for me personally is the process. I enjoy painting as well, but there is something about the methodical back and forth between drawing and scroll saw, the tactile feel of gently pushing veneers through the thin blade, the scratching of the stylus against the tracing paper, the slow build-up of the picture, piece by piece by piece. It's simply something that I enjoy immensely, and there is no other method quite like it. Once all the pieces were cut out, I covered the front with a layer of tape. Up until now I've been taping on the reverse side, with only a few pieces on the front where I absolutely had to. All the construction tape now has to be removed in preparation for the glue, so this tape has to go on first. Here's my substrate, a 7mm pine plywood this time. Glue is applied to both sides. The underside gets covered in a backer veneer in the same glue up. Here's the marquetry. Then I put down some parchment paper to prevent the glue from sticking to a piece of OSB that serves to spread the pressure and protect the surface from the press. You may have seen this press before if you've followed my marquetry journey. It's a bookbinding press with an impact mechanism that I can use while I'm attending art school. Now the panels need some edge banding so the plywood layers don't end up on display. I cut some cross-grained slices of mahogany. This is thicker 2mm veneer for durability, with masking tape on one side as they are very fragile in this state. I made sure the ends are square and taped them together into the circumference of the panels. I will use more tape to hold it in place as the glue dries, so I tore a bunch of pieces in advance to make the glue up go smoothly. I did also cut away the excess from the panels, so now that they are round, I can roll them along this tape and glue centipede and fold the tape pieces up one by one until the whole circle is wrapped in mahogany. I press the panel quite hard into the bench here and pull the tape as tight as I dare without tearing it off to get some pressure on the glue. Where the ends meet, I made sure there would be a small gap remaining. Now I can cut these ends square and glue in the final piece. This way I get a seamless look all around, without having to get the length of the edge banding perfectly right to close without a gap or overlap. Once dry, I could remove the tape and plane down the excess height with a block plane, held angled in towards the panel so I don't tear out the edge banding. Card scraper cleanup is one of the most satisfying steps in the marquetry process. I love taking these colorful wispy shavings and seeing the natural shine of the woods emerge. This time it also came with a somewhat painful realization though, as I saw just how shallow the pigment penetration was on some of the wood types. Walnut and oak especially. A fair bit of uncolored wood peeked through before I was happy with how smooth and level the surface was. So next time I do a batch of dyed veneers, I'll do more research on the different needs of different species, as well as the aforementioned further diluting of the dye. The edge was smoothed with a spoke shave set to a very fine cut, and then hit with a fine sanding sponge. The sanding does make it look very cloudy. Obviously most of the cloudiness disappears with the finish, but I do prefer an unsanded look when possible. On this cross-grain cut, I wasn't happy with the smoothness right off the blade, so some sanding was necessary. And then all that remains is to mount the tops to the bases. Remember those screws that poked out a little? I could now use them to make locating marks in the top, once I had found the location by measuring the distance to the rails on all sides. After drilling very shallow holes for the screw points, I could proceed to the glue up knowing that the top will be set down in the right place and not smear the glue across the underside trying to find the right placement. So now the tops are mounted, they can open to display the image, and there's a small compartment underneath which will be completed with the addition of the plaster casting underneath, creating a little storage space in between the sculpture and the picture. But that's the last of the woodworking steps, so here it was time for finish. I went with my usual go-to, a hard wax oil with no linseed oil in it, as I think it is excellent for bringing out the natural colors with minimal yellowing. You want to spread this type of product really thin, brushing back and forth in all directions to push the viscous finish as far as it will go. Any thick build-up gives it a plastic feel once dry, but if you take your time to brush it out, wipe off the excess about 20 minutes later, and give it a buffing after 24 hours, It gives the most beautiful, natural feeling finish I have found so far. Ideally, the process should be done twice. A single coat can look a bit dry and dull, but this time I only had time for one application and it doesn't look too bad. I added the plaster castings off camera, just with some construction adhesive to a plywood panel, and there we have it. The castings themselves were made almost a year ago, and at that point I had no idea I would want to use them in furniture, so I didn't film that process. But basically, they are negative holes. I was out in the woods, and beneath an old twisted pine tree, I dug a couple of holes in the ground. I poured the plaster, removed the castings, and filled the holes back in. This left me with a negative space of holes that no longer existed. Emptiness turned solid, and I could bring a little piece of the forest with me home without taking anything at all. A little piece of the forest is the title of these pedestals. Thanks for watching.